everyone. Welcome to the Writer's Realm podcast, and thanks for joining us on this epic adventure we call writing. We're your hosts,
Babadato,
Holly Rebillard,
and Austin Matthews.
And today we're going to talk about character archetypes with our guest, Kathleen Bird. Kathleen, welcome.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I guess before we get started, since everybody already knows us, why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Kathleen Bird, and I am a published author. I have a completed fantasy trilogy that's out in the world called the Advent Trilogy. Fun fact about that one, I actually published the first one when I was a sophomore in college.
Wow.
Yeah, so those have been out for a little while. And then my recent projects have been actually in the steampunk genre. So I have an ongoing steampunk fairy tale retelling series.
somebody also has steampunk going on.
There we go. And so I write in that genre currently. I have the first two books in that series, a Pinocchio retelling, and then my most recent book, which actually just published this month, is the Aladdin retelling. So yeah, this is my fourth year doing NaNoWriMo, and I'm working on the next book in the steampunk series. So I'm pretty excited.
Yeah, that sounds so exciting. I like anything that's related to Disney. We'll talk about it later, but actually the project I'm working on for NaNo is also a little bit Disney related. So I think that's so exciting. That's so fun. I can't wait to hear more about this.
That's neat.
Well, I guess now that we're talking about it, how's everyone doing with NaNo? Speaking of,
Good. So I actually got my notification from NaNo. They're like, "Hey, you're almost done. Like once you hit the 75% mark." So that was a really fun email to get.
Wow.
that's really cool.
Do you sleep, Austin, or what the
No,
heck?
not really. So yeah, I've been working on two Nanos because I couldn't decide which one to work on, and so I've been going. So I'm twice as far as I should be, but really, it's like both of them are slightly behind. So I like to put extra pressure on myself. So it's a bad habit. But
Yeah, I will say though, I feel like the 75% email for you is not a surprise at this point. It's been how many years now?
Oh yeah, this is my 12th NaNo. So, but that being said, like last year I did finish with 12 minutes to spare. Like this is the fastest I've ever gotten through NaNo by a long shot.
Goodness gracious. What are you going to do? You're going to start, you're already 74%. You're just going to start like another book? You're like, well, I got a week left. Let's go ahead.
Well, no, because each one is like at the, 22,000 words mark right now. So I'm like, solidly in chapter 12. And like, I mean, I accidentally changed the genre of one of them kind of. So it went from full on sci-fi to fantasy set in the future, which may seem like a small distinction, but it's, pretty huge whenever you go in expecting all of it to be technology. And then it's like, oh yeah, the captain of the starship was, kidnapped by a fade demon or whatever. Like, it's fine. Don't worry about it too much.
That's awesome. Mine is, I am at 25,000. I just hit that a little while ago, maybe 45 minutes ago. So
Nice.
finally halfway through. Yeah, I am very happy about that. I've been doing very well. Looking at my little chart here, I've been trying to reach 2,000 words every time I post, and let me see. I wasn't too successful. There's one day I was 237 and then 617. So like, but I did it. I mean, and one day I had 10 words in the morning and then like, I'm like, well, that's going to be my day, I guess. Cause like, I just did not have any time. And then I just spat it all out. Let me see what I did. I think I did 1,100. That was yesterday. I did 1,100 words yesterday in like a couple of hours, just because like I have to, like I just want to. This is exciting to me. And my work is well, everything I'm doing right now is steampunk based. It's based on my series Coil and Fang. So I'm working on a standalone that's going to be available for free on Amazon. As kind of like a funnel to get into my series. But yeah, so and then after this, I have to finish my book 4, probably starting next month while this one sits. After I pull this one out of the oven, and just let it rest for a while, and then I'll look at it for editing, probably January. But anyway, I'm doing really well.
Awesome. So this weekend was my like Thanksgiving weekend. So I knew that I was not going to get much done this weekend. So I spent the last couple weeks of NaNo before this weekend, trying to just like really beef it up and stuff like that. And I think it actually came at a really good point for me because I was, as much fun as I'm having writing right now, I was kind of like, felt like I was starting to get a little bit sticky with my thought process on my writing. So this came at like the perfect time for a break so that today when I sat down, I was just ready to write again. So I'm sitting at 48% as of around 20 minutes ago. So I'm still trucking along. And obviously with the nice 4-day weekend coming up, I'm sure that that's going to make a huge, huge dent for me. So I'm really excited. This is my first NaNo, so I wasn't really sure what to expect. So I think that my enthusiasm is really helping carry me through it.
That's really good for a first NaNo. My first time I did NaNo, I wrote 16,000 words the whole month. So yeah. Well, I was gonna say this is my best NaNo so far because I'm at like 40%. I'm actually like on par or pretty close to on par. I'm at about 20,000 words. The last couple days, I unfortunately hit like a roadblock in my writing. I'm kind of a plantser, so like I know where the story is headed, but I don't know all the individual details. And so I hit a point in the story where I was like, oh, I'm not sure what happens next. And I'm one of those people who typically does not write every day. I'm not typically a write every day person. NaNo is the one time I do that. And so normally when I hit a roadblock, I'll just like stop working on it for like, you know, a month or 2 months or, you know, in the past, maybe a year. And then I come back. My first book, you know, it got published when I was a sophomore in college, but I started writing it when I was 14. So it took a long time to write. So now I'm down to about a book a year, mostly because of NaNo. So this year I was like, I'm actually going to get all the way to 50,000 words. Last year I was short maybe like 1,000 words or something. Basically, I had, you know, a couple days at the end where I like couldn't write because we had stuff going on. And I was like, well, I still count that as win because I would have reached it.
Yeah, 100%. Like, and that's why I was like, I need to really front load this time because I always waited and I was like, oh, I'm going to put a little extra at the end, a little extra at the end. And I'm like, I have to write, you know, 15,000 words over the weekend. And I'm like, that's not going to happen. So I definitely was like, okay, I'm going to be a good person and just front load it and be prepared because I know I'm a procrastinator. So,
well, I found that it's good to give myself some grace, like especially when I'm in the part of the story where I'm like, I'm in the weeds, I don't really know what's going on. Because if I write a little bit and I push through the weeds like a little bit, then when I get back to the part that I know like a lot about, then I'll have plenty of words, you know. And so on those days, you know, when I'm writing those scenes, it's like, oh, 4,000 words a day. Yeah, I got this, you know.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I got to a part in my outline because I was like, oh, I'm also going to try an outline for the first time ever. And I'm like, got to chapter 12. I'm like, what do you mean the only thing I wrote for the outline was the main character eats lunch? That is a terrible, terrible outline past me. What are you doing?
Yeah, I use these little like note cards and I write like I don't know, people have called them scene blocks or whatever. I just call them like main plot points basically. And in this particular story, I have a bunch of them towards the end, but not very many like on the front end of things. And so I'm like, oh, okay. I gotta get to that part where there's, you know, like 15 things that I know are all happening very quickly.
Now you said this is your fourth, Kathleen, your fourth NaNo?
It is my fourth NaNo. Yep. I used my first NaNoWriMo. I was working on the third book in my fantasy series, finished that up. That was the 16,000 word one. But I did still get the book published within the next year. So I just didn't finish it during NaNo.
Good.
And then after that, I've used NaNo to work on each of my steampunk books. So, and I've done a little bit better every year. So.
And another quick question: are self-published or traditional published?
Yes, self-published. I do everything through Amazon KDP. I admit it, I'm a control freak. I just like to be in control, and it works for me and flexibility. And so I just want to get my stuff out there because I'm, if at some point I made money, that'd be cool. But for right now, I just like, but for right now, I really just, I have stories that I want to share, and I think that other people would enjoy them. And I've gotten pretty good feedback on everything that I've put out there in the world. So it's like, I just hope that people can find them and enjoy them and be blessed.
Right on.
I think that's so important too, right? Like we pour our souls into these books and into our characters and our writing. And it's just nice to know that you've accomplished that for yourself and that there's other people out there who can appreciate that too. Instead of it just, I think it's totally fine if you write a manuscript and you just keep it there for just yourself. But when you work that hard on something, I think it's so great just to be able to share it with other people who are going to love it just as much as you.
And I think I've always been kind of wired that way because like for me, I love creating, but to me, part of the aspect of creating is sharing, so it's like I bake a cake. I don't bake the cake just for me. I bake it so that
I bake the cake.
I do that.
Well, I can bake a cake just for me, but it's more enjoyable.
Right. You want to
That
share.
my help
That's
if
nice.
I share it, So that's kind of the way I approach my writing. As soon as I finished that first book, I was like, how can I get this published now? And at that point, KDP wasn't really a thing yet. So I went through like a vanity publisher, but then once I got the rights back, I republished it through KDP because I was just like, this works for me. So I'm always happy for other people who go the traditional publishing route, but for me, I'm like, I highly recommend this. This works for me.
All right. That's good.
Yeah, I'm also I'm a plantser as well. So what I did this year, I have another novel that I'm working on, but I wanted to come up with something new for NaNo, which I surprisingly did. And so what I did was I actually came up with an outline for where, like, at first I came up with like, this is kind of roughly the storyline I want for the book. And then from there, I progressed into creating like a whole outline for it. So I know the point of view of each character for each chapter. I know where that chapter is taking place. And I kind of know a couple main points that I want to have happen so that I know that I can keep getting from place to place. But like you said, there's a few where it's like just kind of a very casual point to this chapter. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to not only make an entire chapter out of this, but I have to get it from the last chapter to the next chapter in a way that's not just me filling a bunch of pages just to get there. So it's like sometimes it's like you said, you're just kind of trying to muddle through the weeds a little bit. And I know I'm going to go back and like, when I go back through and go through the next draft, there's going to be so much more for me to add and so much for me to take away. So I'm trying not to fret about it too much because I'm terrible for just wanting to go back and constantly correct things. So that was actually my NaNo goal, not to get the 50,000 words, but just to not go back and edit anything, which is a little bit of torture because I actually let these guys both read my first chapter as part of our writing group, and everybody made editing comments and things like that. And it was all I could do. I had to take handwritten notes, so I wasn't tempted to go back to the first chapter and edit.
And our comments were, this has no business being a first draft because it's like all of our finished drafts.
Yeah, it was really, really well written. Yeah, if that's your first draft, goodness gracious. Yeah, you're going to have no problem.
I'm sorry.
It's all downhill from there, I promise.
All of my characters are named Steve 1, Steve 2, Steve 3 in the first draft.
Yeah, I actually had a horse that I just wrote into one of my recent chapters, and I couldn't think of a name for it, so I just started putting it in brackets so I know to come back to it later. I'm like, I don't know, I can't think of a name right now.
Here, yeah.
That's a good name for a horse. Insert name later.
Insert name here. So does your horse really need a name though? It was so funny. I actually had a horse that had a name in my very first book. And that was like when my husband read it, like years later, he was like, why does this horse have a name? And it was because it disappeared rather early on in the book. And he's like, why did you name it if it was going to disappear?
Like 2
chapters
funny.
later.
It depends on why it disappears.
Yeah.
Well, it just kind of disappeared.
It might come back. It's out there somewhere.
So I'm a huge horse lover, and like this horse, horse that I'm describing is actually based off of one of my old horses.
Oh,
So I
okay.
think that's why there's like this emotional attachment for me to this horse. But it's funny. So everything that I'm doing is supposed to, well, the characters are all Greek and Roman based is kind of what the names that I'm going for. So it's funny because now that you said like insert name here, I'm thinking like Insertia or something like that would be a really fun name. So
Why not?
there we go.
It'll be your little inside joke.
Yeah.
You know, something I forgot to mention is I am doing well. However, you know, we're talking about plotting and planting and pantsing. And since I'm a pantser, you sounded, Holly, when you're describing your chapters, that was really good. I mean, point of view, who's doing what. I just seriously write 1 or 2 sentences and that's it. And I got stuck because I did not outline. I'm not listening to our own Preptober guidelines of what to do. I just went up to like chapter 10 or somewhere in there. And I just stopped. I was like, I'll figure it out. No, I didn't figure it out because that's exactly where I got stuck. And I'm like, well, what the heck do I do? I need to write something. And a friend goes, do you know the ending? I'm like, oh my God, that's brilliant. So I wrote part 1 and 2 climax and then the conclusion. So like I finished the book. And then because like I knew all that, I knew where that was going, but now I have to go back and figure out how I got there.
Yeah, I've got the epilogue written for one of my 2, so
nice.
I get it.
I've heard that advice from a lot of people. Like if they're like, if you don't know what to write, then write the part that you do know. And I'm like, I can't do that.
No.
I'm very like everything has to be written in order. There's like no possibility in my, like even when you said that, I'm like, you went to the end and wrote something. And just, like I can't do that.
No.
Yeah. I mean, I even just like throw 2 characters together that aren't even in the story, like, and just be like, hey, I need to get something on the page to do that. So I'm like, I'll pull 2 characters from different books and be like, hey, you're met in a bar. What happened?
Wow.
There you go.
That's funny.
Yeah, I think part of it comes from like a fear that like we're going to write the ending and then, you know, by the time we write the whole book and get back to the ending, like we have this ending that we are just so passionate about and so excited about, and then we write it. And then you go back and write the whole story. And by the time you get to the ending, you're like, this ending doesn't work. Like, there goes my great ending. Now I have to come up with a new one.
Oh,
well, and I will say that's part of it. Like, I do always have a sense of like where I'm ending. Like, even, you know, I remember with my trilogy, my dad like asking me about stuff when I first published my first book. And he's like, why did this character have to die? And it was like, because the 3rd book doesn't work if he doesn't die here. And by the time I finally got the 3rd book published, my dad was like, you were right, that character did need to die in the 1st book. and I was like, yeah. So like I always have this general sense, but I find that I discover the little ways to make it meaningful or like more specific to these characters if I'm writing the end when it's actually the end. I've like discovered more about them. I've like gone on the journey with them, I guess.
That makes sense. Yeah, like that.
And I don't know if part of, because like all of you mentioned that you actually do chapters, and maybe I'm weird, but I actually write the whole book as one thing. And then once I'm done, I go back and I actually count about 10 pages, and that's where I insert the chapters, or like if there's, you know, a scene that spills over or a little less, then I adjust it accordingly. But
that's neat.
So yeah, I find that usually about 10 pages is the proper place for a chapter break, given what's going on. So I just go back and I do all of that at the end.
There might be some like, oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think to me, it makes the story feel more connected as I'm writing it, but that could totally just be in my head.
Now, I was going to say there's some freedom there too, because I think I am writing for the end of the chapter. Like, okay, what's going to happen at the end? You know what I mean? I got Chekhov's gun, you know, in the beginning of the chapter. Now I have to show the gun at the end, or you know, something like that. So what you're saying, the way your style is, there's just more freedom, right? It's just a little bit less pressure and more. It just probably flows a lot more organically.
I'm just telling the story.
Yeah.
And that's kind of always how I've written is I'm like, I'm just telling a story. Like if I were to sit down and just tell this story to a little kid or whatever, or my friend, you know, that's how it is.
That's brilliant.
I always struggle when people ask me about what I'm writing about. And I don't know why I haven't, this is probably also like my fear of writing like blurbs and stuff. Because when I try to explain it, I'm like, how do I explain this without telling you everything, you know? And so I always struggle with that.
See, I feel like now I get to cheat because I'm doing fairy tale retellings. And so
Mm.
I don't really have to tell you, oh, I'm working on an Aladdin retelling, or right now I'm working on a Cinderella retelling. Nobody needs to know anything else. So I don't have to tell you anything else about my story. It's just a retelling.
Yeah, that's why I'm a big
That's
fan of, like, it's a this meets this. Like, it's really helpful because, like, I actually do have one that's kind of a fairy tale retelling as well. It's you know, Peter Pan meets the Lost Boys, as in the movie Lost Boys, where they're all vampires,
Oh,
and
wow.
Oh,
Captain Hook is Van Helsing essentially. And it's like, oh, okay, I know exactly what's happening here. It's weird, but I get it. So
yeah. So the one that I'm working on for NaNo is like I don't want to say it's loosely based on Beauty and the Beast, but it's influenced by Beauty and the Beast. So that's kind of what I've been going with now to tell people is like, oh, it's kind of like a fantasy, but it's loosely, you know, influenced by Beauty and the Beast. So, so actually that was one of the comments that you guys had given me during when you had reviewed my first chapter, was that the one character had reminded you of Gaston. And I was like, perfect. Yes, that's exactly what I wanted to hear, because that's exactly what I was going for. So that was really good, which is then what brought up me thinking about the archetypes, is that, you know, it's really cool to be able to, like, we have those as writers, we have those to lean on, which I think is so important, because a character, I've read a lot of really bad books that I have finished to the end because they just have such great characters.
I agree.
Yeah, so I think they really make or break a book for sure.
Absolutely. It's
Yes.
storytelling, right? Even in movies or whatever. I mean, sometimes the movie sucks, or yeah, the story's kind of blah, but yeah, we want characters because we identify the most with them, not the world. Even though, you know, like say Tolkien, he wrote an incredible. I'm just giving you an example of like Weathertop. When I read about Weathertop, the you know what happened up there, I was so intrigued. Like, what the heck is this thing? Is it magical or what? But who cares? I mean, we love the characters a lot more. We weren't just gonna stay, you know, Weathertop. So, but yeah, character archetypes are definitely like the toolbox, right? We can reach in and yeah. So Kathleen, what are you working as far as I don't know, archetypes? Yeah, what do you have going on in your current project?
Well, so it's funny because when you first were telling me that we were gonna pardon me, that we were gonna talk a little bit about character archetypes during this episode, I was like, huh. I had to kind of think about it, pull like old information from my college literary criticism class, which ironically in college I was very into archetypes, and like I love finding them in other people's writing. I actually did an entire master's thesis that was around like the it's not one of the official ones, but basically the messianic like archetype, or the Christ archetype. And I wrote like 75 pages about the Christ archetype in Arthurian literature. So, you know, a decade or so ago, I was very into archetypes. And then when I look at my writing now, I'm like, yeah, my goal most of the time is to break archetypes. So like maybe I've got a hero in there, but it's not the traditional type of hero. Or for me, a lot of it is like, as I'm developing characters, I want to develop, like, especially for my main characters, I'm wanting to develop like lots of depth and realism, which is difficult to do with a fictional character, because you know you're going to pull some from yourself, you're going to pull some from other people or whatnot, but to give them like their own voice can sometimes be quite difficult. And where I do find that I use archetypes a lot is in my side characters. You know, like in my Aladdin retelling that I just published, I have a caregiver or a caretaker, or whatever the proper name for that is. And that is her sole purpose in this particular book, is to take care of the princess character, essentially. And she she ticks all those boxes, she fills all that purpose. I do have a recurring character in this series that will eventually get fleshed out more, that kind of takes on the role of like the sage. He's the Gandalf type character, you know, but my main characters never tend to fit nicely in boxes, which is funny since right now I'm writing fairy tale retellings. So there's things you expect from an Aladdin story or from a Pinocchio story, or now as I'm writing Cinderella, I'm like, well, this is kind of interesting because you have these in your mind, like, you know what the prince character should be and you know what the Cinderella character should be, and obviously you're going to hit those tropes in there, those things that readers are expecting, but the traditional like layout of our heroine and hero characters, I have fun trying to mess around with them a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's a really fine line as well, because I think that a lot of people, I mean, I don't come from a writing background. I mean, I did a lot of like philosophy writing and stuff like that in college, and then I got into science. So most of the stuff that I write on a daily basis is research papers. So I don't really need to know much about characters or anything like that. So when I started writing, it was a whole new world for me. And so I didn't really realize, I just thought, oh, you have a main character and then you have like your supporting characters and that's it, right? So for people who don't know about an archetype, it's basically, as the way that I interpret it anyways, is that it's a character or an event or something that is notably like recurrent across pretty much all of the world or whatever, all human experiences, right? Because it gives readers a sense of familiarity. They can relate to that character, they can relate to that event, or they can relate what's going on without really having to think about why they relate to it. But you can't confuse that with stereotype. And I think that that's where a lot of books that just fall a little bit flat is because of that, because they have people who take a lover, for example. You could have a character who's a lover and they're things that they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be very caring. They're supposed to be protective. They're supposed to be devoted to the person that they love, and their cons or the downsides of them is sometimes they're a little bit obsessive, or maybe they lack their own identity because everything about them is crafted to cater to that one person. And that within those parameters, you can still create a really deep character, but it's not a stereotypical person where it's like, oh, this woman is, or this person is falling, because of this handsome man, they're completely weak in the knees. And then that's all there is to their character, right? And that's where it really falls flat, is by allowing your character to become a stereotype and just two-dimensional, instead of letting them have like other characteristics. You can still be caring and obsessive about a person, but there can also be a lot of other sublevels. Like, what is it about that character that makes them caring? Or why are they so obsessive? What's happened in their past relationships or, with their family or their friends or whatever, that's now made them like cling on to this person like it's their only source of life. So yeah. I think that there's just that, you have to just be so careful to not let it fall flat if you're going to try and put a good character in there.
Yeah, and I think part of it too is like people are so much more complicated than that. Like whenever we in our lives do something that's not like ourselves, like we're said that we're like out of character. Well, those out of character moments are what make us real people. And so the weirdness is like, to have real characters, they have to have out of character moments in realistic ways. And so something I found really helpful is I use Enneagram types for my characters. And so they've got this predictive way of like how a certain personality will react in like stressful situations, or like whenever they're like in these moments of like decisiveness, they'll either like shift to this one kind of personality or another. And I look at that as a guide. It's like, okay, well, like how would my bookworm react in this kind of a thing? And it's like, I have experience as a bookworm, like that is my personality. But like if I'm trying to like see what somebody else is doing, like it's a little bit like a tool to help me get in their head a little bit easier as to like, okay, I know they're stressed and they're going to react poorly to this, as opposed to like the way that they could stand up to this moment and have this growth moment. And so how am I going to have them actually be in this moment going, I know this is how I should act, but I'm going to do this other thing instead. And we get to relate to that failure or their success even though it's out of their normal character. So having my bookworm go, you know what? No, this isn't okay. I'm going to stand up to this and put up a fight. And so like those are the moments that we like live for, because like that's the growth, the arc that we're actually looking for in our characters.
Yeah, and I like what you had mentioned, Kathleen. Like they're not in a box, so they can get out and play around, kind of like what Austin's talking about and what Holly's talking about. What's especially when she mentioned about what's driving the character, because like I have an assassin, so they should be a villain, and in some respects they are, but she was trained to kill when she was a kid. Like she kind of didn't have a choice in the matter, and that's all she knows. And unfortunately, she's very guilt driven because she feels responsible for letting her sister die. So she kind of has herself put herself in her own box. Like, well, this is who I am, and it's the job of the hero that she's working with to try to let her see, like, no, you're more than that. And even and I have the ghost of her sister, as a child still there. Like, this is ridiculous. I have a ghost and a vampire, and I don't know what else I have. But like, but even the little sister is like, no, you're actually good. She's kind of like the good part of her conscience, telling her, no, you're human. You're not a monster. You're human. But yeah, in case you're new to the writing thing and you go, well, what should I pick? Well, yeah, pick something, but yeah, don't stay there. It's just a guideline, right? Draw color outside the box, like we're all talking about. Like that's what enriches your writing, that enriches your character, makes them way more interesting. That was a good point with the stereotypes, because I immediately thought of like a gumshoe detective. You're immediately going to think of, well, they're an alcoholic, something happened in their past, and they can't stop cursing or they can't stop drinking, and it's just so typical. And in a way it kind of works, but they're flat, like we're talking about. You don't want flat, you want three-dimensional.
Yeah.
So just
and that kind of works for minor characters.
Yeah,
so it kind of works for minor characters, but it's like, if that's supposed to be my protagonist, like something else needs to be going on there. Like I can't handle 300 pages of this, or several books of this very flat character I've read dozens and dozens of times. And so getting into, like you were saying, like subverting those kind of archetypes, but like it's important to have that framework to work against. So it's like this shorthand of like, okay, I'm going to have the reluctant hero underdog. Cool, I know what that looks like. And then, you know what? At the end, he's going to fail. Like, that's going to be my subversion. It's like the underdog's going to lose, and you're not going to expect it, and you're going to be devastated because he's devastated.
A lot of times, like when I'm writing, I tend to do this a lot with my more recent work, is where I'm looking at, what are the normal traits of this type of character, and then I think about how can they have those traits but also have something else. Like I'm a big fan of like both, and like people don't have to be just one or the other. So like for example, in my current retelling, I have my Cinderella character, who of course is going to hit some of the traditional things we expect from Cinderella, and that she works hard and she's kind and she's got those kind of things going on, but she also has other characteristics, like she has a temper, and like things like that are, as you said, subverting a little bit, or whatever the case might be, because it just I think like you said, those out of character moments are what make people. And I think that especially as we write like hero and heroine characters, when people read them, with my fantasy series, that was one of my things that I wanted to do, was all of them are female leads, and the story arc follows the very traditional kind of like heroine's journey sort of a thing in all three books. But there's a lot of like turmoil and growth and stuff that happens, because if all you have is a hero who ends up winning, then the people who are on the journey with you as they read go, that's really awesome. And I feel uplifted that that person did it, but I couldn't do that if I were in their situation. And so I always look for, where are those moments where I can hit on something that is relatable to me, you know, as a person in our modern day world with modern day problems. You know, I'm not in a medieval fantasy world. I'm not in a steampunk Victorian world, but these truths still apply. And so those are kind of the things that I look for as I write.
Yeah, and speaking specifically of the heroine's journey as compared to the hero's journey, I feel like it's just a more relatable structure. Because it's like you've got this legendary figure of the hero's journey. It's like, cool, I'm glad you won all on your own gumption and like got through it. But like the heroine's journey is just such a beautiful like exploration of like, hey, like we're all in this together. Like I can't just strike out on my own, just like none of you can strike out on your own. We're all part of this community together. It's just such a more beautiful message. So
yeah, I think it's important too that, I mean, depending on the book or what you're writing, like if you're writing a novel or a trilogy or anything like that versus a novella or a short story, obviously it's way different, but it's important to realize that for a standard novel, you have a long time, you have a lot of chapters to develop your character. And I see so many books that I read and the character is like this just like really bad person. And then they're like, oh, no, actually now I'm a good person. And it's like, there's like this, there's this big divide where you can see like they just completely turned into an entirely different character. And it's not realistic. And that is where characters will fall flat because you're giving them different, you know, things to their personality, but it's like you're giving it at face value. There's no explaining why they started to change their mind, why they felt like that in the beginning, why they wanted to change, what made them change. And so that can really help fill your pages too, is like, it's a journey, and it's not just a journey, even if you're on like a quest, the quest isn't the only journey, right? It's each character has their own journey that you can go through all those pages and discuss it. Take your time when you're like developing your characters and when they're thinking about things, just like we do in real life.
Yeah. And thinking about that too, it's like, yeah, you have these like other basically the story structures for each one of your characters, but like we're not all on one journey in life. So like we're all taking part in several story arcs all at the same time, and your characters are too. So like instead of thinking of like, oh, my A plot is my main character, my B plot is my side character, it's like, oh no, I have one A plot of my main character, then my main character has a 1B plot because they've got this, you know, romance arc going on, or whatever it may be. They may have 2 or 3 different arcs throughout the story if you're, you know, writing epic fantasy, whereas like you only have one main arc and that's it if you're writing, you know, a short story. So just keeping that in mind, the more length you have, the more you should be thinking about how complex you're getting into the nuance of, you know, humanity.
Well, and I think one of the things that has helped me, like as I think about like pacing of the character growth is, you know, growing up, I read tons of Christian fiction, Christian fantasy, Christian whatever. I read Christian whatever in lots of different genres. And I think we can all think of examples of books where like this moment where they made their commitment to Jesus just landed a little flat because it didn't make sense. Because as you were saying, Holly, like they were way on the other side, and then all of a sudden there's like one singular moment, and that does happen for people. Sometimes that is their story, but I think more often, you know, as we're growing in you know, a relationship with Jesus, that takes time, and the commitments happen in like lots of small steps. And so as I write about my characters and their growth, you know, even if it's not a faith journey, I do think about that concept of like, would they change their minds this quickly? How deep is this other truth rooted within them? You know, how long would it take for them to change? Whether it's like, how long would it, if they're a very, you know, scared to open up kind of person, you know, they're not just going to have one conversation and then suddenly be the most open person you've ever met. There's going to be, you know, a little bit of back and forth, and, you know, they're going to be really good one day, and then, you know, the next minute something will happen and they kind of like, oh, I got to go back in and build all the walls up, you know? So I think like when we, you know, that's just one example of where we can look and see like, what does that growth journey look like? What does that story arc look like? and how can I slow it down in a way that makes sense? And, you know, in terms of plotting, how can I put things into the story that are going to push them? If I want them to end up here, then I have to put the things in there along the way that are going to move them on that scale very slowly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's not to say that there's not a clear turning point for a character, which is completely different than a character just becoming a different character.
Right.
One of my favorite lines that I've read in the last couple of years in a book, the story follows this young girl, and she's not young, she's in her 20s. And so it follows this girl, and she thinks that there's this guy who's going to assassinate her eventually. And so there's like a lot of this tension between them. And we don't really see much of this guy, but we follow her character as she's growing and she's becoming a stronger person. And she's just maturing a little bit as a person. So we're following her storyline, and it kind of starts to intertwine with him a little bit. And of course, by the end of the novel, you know, they end up falling for each other. But when you look at the beginning of the book and you're like, how did they go from here to here? It's not like one day he just woke up and like became like a totally different character. And there's this one line in the book where she's talking about how proud she is. She did something that she shouldn't have. And she's like, you know, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. And he was just turned around, and this character like explodes. And he's like, well, the F aware. And then he was surprised like at his own reaction, and she was surprised. And that was kind of like the turning point for them, because like the fact that he was surprised by his reaction just made it seem like a really emotional action, which is something that a regular person could relate to, right? Like you finally are like explode with that feeling or that emotion or whatever. And so that for me is like, I always think about that when I'm, you know, when you're trying to reach a turning point, leave those little cookie crumbs, the little bit of tension building up to that. And then once you hit that turning point, remember that that's just the beginning of the second part of your character's journey. It's not like, oh, well, now they're in love because he realized that. Like, they're still going to be battling their own demons and their own feelings and stuff like that for the other half of the novel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, even like thinking about like the hero's journey, which is like this very almost kind of flat character going through this journey of like, oh, I can do everything. Like, there's still the temptation. Like, even that has a temptation to fall, like to not do the thing, and they refuse the call. Like, yeah, we've seen it a million times, but even those guys or you know, whoever is going through that have those same things. So like, if it's been acknowledged for thousands of years that like, we don't want to just go, oh yeah, he was asked to do a thing, they did the thing, they went home, cool. Like, there has to be some sort of roadblock or barrier or, you know, temptation to like go be selfish.
And I think one of the things to do when you're doing like that kind of stuff, like especially like hero's journey or archetypes or whatever, is looking, you know, at examples that we are already familiar with. Like, you know, when you look at the articles online or whatever, it's like, oh, the sage is like Gandalf. And it's like, oh, okay. You know, I think that sometimes that can help us where we're like, who's the Joker or whatever. And it's like, oh, well, it's so-and-so, you know, from movie or popular culture or whatever. And it's like, oh, I think that sometimes that's a good starting point if you're like not sure how to really dive into some of these archetypes.
Yeah, and also going ahead and labeling like how yours is going to be different, like what twist you're going to be. Like, okay, it's Gandalf, but he's actually the youngest of them, or like what, however you do it. Like, I mean, like Merlin's a great example. It's like, oh, hey, like if Merlin shows up and he's old, he's actually really young. So like, that's a weird thing that you have to take into consideration. So if he shows up looking like Gandalf, he knows nothing. So.
You know what I liked was the Umbrella Academy. Have you guys watched that? There's this one character, I think he's number they give them all numbers. They don't have names, they have numbers. It's silly. But this kid shows up and he's like 12 years old, but he's really the oldest, and he's the Gandalf character.
Oh yeah.
And it is so cool. Yeah, he just shows up and like, what are you doing here, kid? And like, he knows how to fight and he knows everything under the sun, but he's like trapped in a 12-year-old body or something like that. And that's just great. Yeah, if we could just think it like we're talking about, like, okay, I got this Gandalf character. How can I make him? He's Gandalf, but okay, but what's different? You know, maybe he wears lady hats. I don't know. But
like specifically, it's like Gandalf is like the old sage. So it's like, okay, well, I need him to be the sage, but do I need him to be old? No. So like, that's such an easy thing to be like, why is age wisdom? Like, it's not. Wisdom is wisdom, however you got it.
Yeah, that's really true. It makes me think of so the magic system that I'm using, it's a little bit more prominent in the Blood Sky, but also in this in Heartbound that I'm working on for NaNo. You're born with a little bit of power. Some people are born with a lot more. And like to me, it was always kind of like when I was first starting to flesh it out, I was like, well, who's to say, like, why does it have to be like the most powerful person? You know what I mean? That like it always seems to be like the person that has the most power is like the ruler or the best person or whoever runs the kingdom. And so for me, one of the things that I put into place was that you have to be basically, so you're born with the amount of power you're supposed to get, but you don't get access to it until you prove yourself. So you could have like an unending amount of power and potentially be a ruler or whatever, you know, but if the gods don't deem you worthy, you know, in the first like 23 years of your life, then you're not going to have any more power than, you know, that you need to just do a few little parlor tricks. So that for me was kind of like a little check against that, because it's like, you know, that always seems to be the way that it is. If you have the most power, then you are the most powerful, and then you're just the ruler. So it's kind of just looking for little ways to just put a spin on things.
Yeah, and like actually I have a really strict magic system in my Kindle Vela book. And so basically it's like, okay, you're one of 5 ranks. So I mean it's very like X-Men like, where it's like they like clearly denote how powerful you are. And so it's like, yeah, the big bad guy is a 5, but his right-hand person is a rank 2. And like that's the second most powerful person in the entire thing. There's tons of other rank 4s and 5s, but they're the most powerful because they are ruthless and they're determined and they will stop at nothing. And so just they're like, I'm going to take this little teeny tiny thing that I have and I'm going to work my entire life to be disciplined. And their discipline is like their superpower, essentially. Like, I can do more because everybody told me I can't. And so like just finding that way of like, okay, they don't need to be powerful to be powerful. Like they just are because of who they are is really a fun thing.
All right. Well.
Oh, sorry. I got lost. I was thinking about something and I just totally was having a conversation with myself in my brain.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
That's why we're here. Yeah. Join us
Like,
next week when we get into Holly's brain and try to figure out.
It's a terrifying place to be.
That's funny.
Yeah, I think it's really funny too. Like, even in terms of like, obviously, since we said we were going to be talking about characters, I've been thinking a lot about characters and development and things like that. And it's really fun when you think about like the protagonist versus the antagonist as well. Because it's always like protagonist is good, antagonist is bad. And I started thinking a lot about actually what Austin talks about, just killing off people. And I was thinking about it in terms of characters. And I just thought, you know, it's really fun to me. I thought it would be cool to work into a storyline somewhere. You know, you have your protagonist who's like the good person and, you know, whatever. And there's this, you know, almost like a side character who's just the antagonist, who's just like a really bad person that ends up killing the protagonist. But it turns out that they're killing the protagonist was actually the antagonist the whole time. And just like, you know, like fun little twists like that. I think it's just like such a good way to change stuff up, right?
I love evil protagonists. That's my jam.
I was gonna say I love like unreliable narrators where like you think you know what's going on and then it's like, nope, that is not how it is.
Yeah.
That's how my first book I published was the first character you meet. You're like, okay, I assume that the first character I meet, I spend 8 to 10 chapters just in their point of view. They're the protagonist. They have to be the good guy. And like over and over again, you see more that they're doing. You're like, I don't like this person very much at all. And so it's like at a certain point, whenever they like don't come out on top, you're like, oh, okay, cool. I'm glad I wasn't actually supposed to be rooting for them.
Yeah, Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl did really good with that. Like halfway through the book. Oh, spoiler alert! Sorry, but I won't I won't go on. But anyway,
I mean, it was a major
fantastic.
blockbuster at this point, so I
Yeah.
think you're probably fine. If they wanted
Yeah.
to see it or read it, they could have already.
Yeah, that is fun.
I
Or even better, make your antagonist somebody that you're like, oh my god, I hate this, but man, they're right, you know? Like, oh my gosh, I'm almost rooting for this guy now. Yeah.
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do right now is to try and split it between like 2 or 3 opposing forces and like really make it difficult to tell who is the protagonist, who's the antagonist, like all of the morals and ethics. It's like, okay, I can see the side, like everybody's got a point. They're all right, but they're also really wrong. And so just like, if you could all come to the table and just talk it out, you'd probably be good. But like none of you are interested in that.
Well, it's actually, I was told once that like a protagonist and an antagonist usually have a lot of very similar goals.
Mhm.
And it just comes down to perspective, right? Especially like the reader's perspective, like what are most readers going to think is wrong? And why do they think it's wrong? And what do they think is right? Because an antagonist can be doing all the right things or all the wrong things. And if the protagonist does those, then they can, they can be doing the exact same things, but you're like, oh no, this person's doing it for the right reasons. It's like, well, what is that? What, what constitutes as the right reason?
Yeah, it's the classic foil.
Yeah, I read a novel recently that it was a romance novel, which was not usually something that I read, but I read this one, and the man that was in this novel, it was part of the novel was told from his perspective and part of it was told from her perspective. And when it was told from his perspective, we were seeing things behind the scenes that she wasn't seeing. And he seemed like this really, really nice guy. But then when he was with her, he seemed like this really bad, shady character. And I thought that was so interesting because it's a complete flip, right, to what you would normally see. Because normally you're like, oh yeah, he's trying to be this really great guy for her. But it was the complete opposite. Like he was showing her like this really ruthless side of him. But not to say that it was a good or a bad side. It was just a different side of him. So I thought it was really interesting to how they kind of reversed the roles that you would expect to see.
Well, Kathleen, you're doing steampunk retelling, fairy tale retelling. So all of us know who Pinocchio is and Geppetto. So like, how do you monkey around with that to make it like your story,
So that was actually why I started with Pinocchio, because it is a retelling that there's not a lot of them out there, but also my very first thought that started that series was, what if Pinocchio was a clockwork doll? So it's actually a gender bent Pinocchio retelling.
That is so cool.
And Perry, my Pinocchio character, is a clockwork doll, and she was a really fun character to write because I read the original Pinocchio story. That's one of the things I love doing with my retellings is I go back to the originals and I pull stuff that may not have made it into the Disney version, but it's from the original, and I like pulling those little threads even if nobody catches them. And so it was really fun because I take those ideas and those themes and then think about like what fairy tales always have a moral of the story kind of a thing, like what is the lesson that she's supposed to learn, what are the questions that she's going to struggle with, sort of a thing. And so the themes end up being very similar to the original one, but yeah, they're repackaged in this new context. So she has issues with her dad. She has issues with like, I'm made of clockwork, I'm not a real person, like some of those themes that we hear from the Pinocchio story. She's got one of the themes in that particular, it's called The Truth Beyond the Lies is actually the title of that one, and a recurring theme in that book is actually discernment and the idea of like looking beyond just what we see to see what the truth is. She's got some friends that the audience can this plays with the unreliable narrator thing. From Perry's perspective, these people are nice and they're my friends, but like, spoiler alert, the audience can tell pretty much right away, like those are not your friends. Like, you know,
That's right. Yeah.
it's kind of like when you're watching a horror movie, which I don't do a lot of because I don't like, but it's like when you're watching a horror movie and you're like, don't go there. Don't go into the abandoned barn, you know,
Right.
that's where the killer is hiding, you know, like it.
Yeah.
And so that was, you know, kind of how I repackaged that story. And then of course, like in the Aladdin retelling again, I'm looking at how do I take this like Persian, you know, very Middle Eastern story and repackage it in like Victorian kind of vibes. And so you know, the thief character became like a confidence man, and the Sultan's daughter became, you know, a trained mogul's daughter, you know, I mean, some of that kind of stuff. So it's like, how do I take this same concept and repackage it into a new world? So like in my Cinderella retelling that I'm working on right now, I don't have the prince character is not a prince. He's the son of someone who owns a factory empire. And the Cinderella character is actually a factory worker. That's what she is. And so has kind of some Dickens vibes in there as well. But I think that's the thing when you're looking for this type of writing, you're looking for how can I take this thing that people are expecting and put it into my world in a way that makes sense. So
That's awesome. That's perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, before we wrap up, we like to do something we call the don'ts. So I think that we should do a little round of don'ts. So what we basically do is we go around and we all just say something, can be related to NaNo. It could just be related to writing in general. It could be really anything. And we just say our advice of something we don't think that you should do.
Got it.
Bob started this. He threw me completely for a loop the first time. I didn't know what to say, so I just rambled for 5 minutes. But now I'm starting to catch on. I start to think about these things in advance.
And I did not.
I did not either.
Which means I should go last, right? 'Cause I'm like,
Yeah, of course.
Absolutely. I will start then, I guess,
Okay.
since I brought it up. So my don't for this week is don't stress about the words that you're using. By which, what I mean is that don't stress about, you're going through your first draft. You're not going to be sitting there writing your first draft with a thesaurus, right? So for me, for example, I know there's a lot of like gazing going on in my books right now, which obviously I'm not going to have someone gazing at this or gazing at that every other paragraph for the entire novel. But for me, that's kind of the word that I'm using is like, I know something needs to be going on where there needs to be some sort of interaction with somebody's face or their eyes, or something needs to be happening that's involving them looking at something. But it would waste a lot of my writing time if I was to sit down and really flesh out those descriptions. So when you're writing your first couple drafts, I think just don't worry about the words that you're using and just really try to force yourself to get through it. And you can always fix those things later. So don't stress the words.
Don't stress the words. Excellent.
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and piggyback a little bit off of that. And I'm going to say that, like, if you were going through and you are here in NaNo, you're building a giant block of words, don't be afraid to be Michelangelo and go and chip them off in order to reveal David. Like, don't be afraid to leave things cut off on the floor. And that's kind of the goal of NaNo, is you're getting a giant block out there and you're going to go in and cut a bunch. If you're cutting words, cutting sentences, you're cutting chapters, you might be cutting the whole thing and making a new outline. And that's okay. The whole thing is the practice of writing, getting it out there, getting it done. And you're going to be better off for it no matter what gets left on the floor.
I would go with don't compare yourself to others, because I was honestly doing that when we started, and we're in a writing group, Austin, Holly, and I, and they would share where they're at, how many, or it might have been on our own Discord, but I'm at this, I'm at that, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what? That's like my joke with Austin, like, do you even sleep? Do you work? What do you? Are you a machine? But like, who cares? Like, he's living his dream, man. Where's my dream? I need to just sit my butt down and write my story, my words. So yeah, don't let that, because it can be you can be dissuaded. You know, you can be discouraged from seeing somebody else jumping up to however many words, and then that's going to affect you. Like, just, hey, congratulate them, high five, wherever you're at, because there's some people that are at like 10%. They've just got a few thousand words, and we want to be encouraging to them too. But yeah, so don't compare yourself to others. That'd be my don't.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that's been like our big thing with NaNo this year, is really trying to stress that NaNo isn't just about putting 50,000 words down. It's about developing better habits as a writer and just helping yourself and encouraging yourself, like set your own goals and make your own progress, because that's what matters.
So I would say, don't hate yourself. And that's kind of a weird way to say it, but basically, like, I think as writers, we are often the most critical of our own writing. And so as we're reading things, we look back and we're like, wow, I hate every part of this. It is terrible. And if somebody else were to hand us their writing, even if it was awful, we wouldn't say that to them. We wouldn't be like, hey, your writing is terrible. We would find nice things to say about it. So I think that it's healthy to apply that to our own writing as well. So instead of immediately going, wow, all of this is awful, what's like one good thing that you like about this? Don't hate on yourself. Just give yourself a little bit of grace.
I love that. That's good.
Yeah, that's really,
so
really
nice.
good. I like that. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure to have you. Before we go, tell us how we can find you, whether it's social media or a website, or how our listeners can follow you as well and see what you're up to.
Yeah, so I have a website, which is adventtrilogy.wordpress.com. And on there you can find info about all my books. I'm also published in a bunch of anthologies. I write reviews for Clean Fiction magazine, and I do some reviews on my blog as well. So you can find all of that there. You can also find the sign up for my email newsletter. I send out one every other month. I promise I don't spam you, with updates about my writing and behind the scenes things. You can also follow me on Instagram at birdsthewords. I post there most frequently, and so that's probably the best place other than my website to find me, although you can also find me on Facebook at Kathleen Bird.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much. For all of our listeners, don't forget to rate and subscribe to our channels at the link below so you don't miss any of our Writers Realm content. We always love to hear from our listeners. So if you have a question or a topic or anything that you want us to dive into, get in touch. And not only on YouTube, but you can also find us on Spotify, on Apple, and a couple other of your favorite podcast platforms.
Yeah. iHeartRadio. There's something else. Yeah. I forget too. I'm the one that made everything.
Podbean.
I don't know.
Podbean. There you go.
Yeah.
You look for us, you'll find us, I promise.
Yes.
There you go.
All right, until next time.
Bye, y'all.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.